So I want to start this way. Israel looms large in this election, we know that. But there's also very different ways of interpreting what's the greatest threat to Israel. On the one hand, we know that the Prime Minister Netanyahu, has said, and I believe, Bill, you have also strongly agreed with this, that the greatest existential threat to Israel now is posed by Iran, and the possibility that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon. And certainly the statements that the Iranian leaders have made and their past behaviors make this threat a very real one. On the other hand, there are also many people, including now the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, Shaul Mofaz, who've said that the greatest threat to Israel is not an outside threat, it's really the threat posed by the lack of a two-state solution, that the problems of occupation and the fact that there hasn't been a way of dividing the land between Israelis and Palestinians ultimately is the greatest threat. So I'd like to ask each of you, why isn't the other threat most important? Bill, why isn't the lack of a two-state solution more important than Iran? And Jeremy, why isn't Iran more important than a need for a two-state solution? And you could toss a coin as to who's going first.
Well, I'm happy to go first, if that's all right. So first of all, let me just say thank you as well to the clergy and to the congregation of B'nai Jeshurun and to both Bill Kristol and Jane Eisner for this evening. This is a congregation that's very dear to me since the first date that my wife and I had was coming to Shabbat services here. In addition to the connection through collegiate and the B'nai Jeshurun, is really a night to come home, so I appreciate that. I think one of the fallacies of the debate and really underlying the question is the notion that there's one threat that has to be dealt with, either or. In fact, the threats that face every country are multiple and multifaceted, and for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel, the threats are not just a either or between Iran and the lack of a two-state solution. There are long-term threats across the region. The threat that I think we probably would agree on is the united threat of moderation versus extremism in the region, that extremism within Israel, extremism in its neighbors, versus the moderate, more democratic movements. That's a fundamental rift in the region that I think is may define really the overarching threat. So I don't know that the frame of the question, having to choose one threat, is really the right one. And my argument would be that Israel needs to be, and every country needs to be, capable of dealing with multiple threats at once. And Iran is a potential threat. The development of nuclear weapons by Iran is a threat not only to Israel but to the world in terms of nuclear non-proliferation. But I would say that the existential threat of a lack of a two-state solution, that's certainly what motivates me. It's what motivates J Street. It's what causes us to get up and fight in the morning, because without a two-state solution over the coming generation, we do know that Israel will have to choose between being a Jewish home and a democracy, and that's a choice that Israel shouldn't have to make.
So, Bill, how would you respond?
Well, let me also join Jane and Jeremy in thanking you for having us here and saying how great it is to be back at BJ. Our daughter, I was last year 5 years ago for our daughter's Ufruf with Elliot Silver, and his parents are here, John and Orly, and they assured me before this, though I thought an Ufruf would be an impressive connection with a shul, but it's not as good as first date. I mean, so I think I'm really at a disadvantage here, I mean, anyway, I won't. We can get beyond the date issue and the Ufruf issue. No, and Orly and John assured me that most of you, of course, would be sort of on my side of this debate. Actually, they didn't assure me of that, and I wouldn't have believed it since I grew up on the Upper West Side of New York, and I think I know what the general views of people are here. But it's great to be here. It's fun. It's always good to have this kind of discussion. No, I don't think it's a close call. I think a nuclear-armed Iran is a threat to Israel that way transcends various domestic difficulties, political difficulties that Israel has, or the difficult question of how to divide up the lands or give up most or all of the lands that were won in the war in 1967. That's for 45 years. Israel has had its current borders, or really actually gave back some land and withdrew from Gaza, obviously, in 2005. So slightly smaller, occupies, controls less land than it did a few years ago. I don't know that that's really, I supported that, but I don't know that it's much increased the chances for peace or for a solution in the region. But that is a problem that people should work on solving, but it is not an existential threat to the state of Israel. It is not the case, in my opinion, that if the current borders exist not for 45 years, but for 65 years or 85 years, that Israel will cease to be a Jewish or a democratic state. That shows a real lack of confidence, I think, in the people of Israel and their ability to keep the state both Jewish and democratic. The two great threats are nuclear Iran and the delegitimization of Israel, of which there is a concerted effort, obviously worldwide, and which needs to be resisted almost as much as a nuclear-armed Iran dedicated to the destruction of Israel.
But Bill, what do you say about the demographic argument that even if the people of Israel now, and I assume you're talking mostly about the 80% or so who are Jews, can do their absolute best to maintain a democratic society, you have growth in both the indigenous population, but also in the occupied lands that could dwarf the number of Jews living in this larger space.
It's not going to dwarf. No serious projection shows that Israel would become less than a majority Jewish really for forever, for the foreseeable future. The Arab birth rate is actually declining, which is what usually happens when people get wealthier. Giving up Gaza obviously removed an awful lot of non-Jews from the total territory currently controlled by Israel. So I don't believe that's the case, and I think, and look, if it were the case, I'm not for keeping all the occupied territories, if that's the term we're using tonight for convenience. I'm not going to quibble about it, but I'm not for keeping, the government of Israel will have to decide what it can safely withdraw from and whether it can find a negotiating partner to whom to hand over the areas from which it withdraws, consistent with its security and with the general security of the population there. But it's not going to be the case that the state of Israel is going to become minority Jewish.
So Jeremy, how do you respond?
Well, I did know we were going to disagree on opinions. I didn't know we were going to disagree on facts. The population between the Jordan and the Mediterranean today is about 12 million people, and half of them are Jewish and half of them are not. I mean, that's simply the fact of the number of people who live on the West Bank in Israel pre-67 in Gaza. So those are the numbers according to the Hebrew University Demography Department, which in fact found that in 2010, of the people in that area, Jews actually only made up 49.8% of the people. And so the question really becomes relatively quickly, not in 85 years, not in 65 years, but within this decade, will everybody who lives in that geographic area have equal rights, or will a minority continue to have the sole political power over a majority that isn't Jewish? And that's not a very pretty picture, and it's not the type of democracy that I think you're in favor of as somebody who favors democracy.
You're counting Gaza in that?
I am counting Gaza.
And you think that's now part of Israel somehow?
It is under Israeli control, yes.
And you think the Israelis have not tried as hard as they can to give Gaza back to its residents?
Well,
Do you think Israel would like to control Gaza?
Well, when they allow the free import and export of goods, and they don't...
Including weapons?
Including people, in and out, students who would like to simply go and study abroad, who are not allowed out. As long as the borders are fully controlled by the state of Israel, then yes, the geographic area is under Israeli control. You don't see it that way?
No, and I don't see it as a huge problem. Do you seriously, you're sitting here and telling me that 10 years from now, if the current borders exist, if the current political arrangement exists, the current situation of Arabs in Israel, of course, having full citizenship, Arabs in the West Bank having limited political rights, but obviously quite a lot of freedoms, Arabs in Gaza, unfortunately, having very little in the way of rights because they're governed by Hamas. You're telling me that Israel will not be a Jewish and democratic state 10 years from now if there are 200,000, 400,000 if there's a higher growth rate among the Arab population than the Jewish population?
When people who had a different skin color than you and I had limited rights in certain parts of this country, was that a full democracy? Is that what your idea of a democracy is?
No, and I am not for an Israel that includes Gaza, and I don't think anyone in Israel is
No,
much
but you
either.
just said
It's
the
a
West
total,
Bank.
it's a total red herring. I'm not for an Israel that includes most of the West Bank, and nor is the Israeli government, nor is the Likud party, nor is Ariel Sharon. And so what's the issue there? I'd be thrilled. Most Israelis would be thrilled. It's not my call, but I think 90% of Israelis would be thrilled to be able to get out of the huge bulk of the populated areas of the West Bank.
I'm still sort of a little stunned, though, at the notion that the people who live on the West Bank, who are under Israeli control, that you would consider that to be a democracy, to have limited political rights based on the racial background of the people.
I didn't say anything about the racial background of the people.
So
they're not all of one race. Why have you brought race into that? Do you
Palestinian.
believe they're a separate race?
Palestinian.
Oh, you think that's a race?
It's a nation. It's a
Right,
national
okay.
identity.
So there's,
yes.
well, it is a national identity, and that's why I would be happy if there could be a two-state solution with a peaceful Palestine next to a peaceful Israel. And I believe that Israeli governments of both parties have tried extremely hard for that solution, and I do not believe it is likely to happen in the very near future, not because of Israel, but because of, unfortunately, of the sentiments of too many people living in those territories.
And
outside agitators who, unfortunately, fund some of the worst elements in those territories, obviously.
So as we head down the road over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years, and there are, in fact, more non-Jews than Jews in the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, and the political power belongs to only the Jews, that doesn't disturb you?
I think it's an unfortunate situation. Absolutely. But what's the solution to it?
The solution is...
I supported Sharon getting out of Gaza.
The solution
You
would
think
be...
if they get out even more, if they just throw the borders open and let people come, I mean, they do let an awful lot of people come in and out. I think it's not quite fair to the Israeli government, what you're saying, and you're probably
In
more of an
Gaza?
expert. You're more, yes.
An awful lot of people are allowed in and out of Gaza.
Some people are allowed in and out of Gaza.
Some people, right. There's a big
Well, but
difference between
if you want to take the position that they should just open the borders and, hey, anytime, come on across, no problem, is that your position?
No, my position is that there should be a two-state solution, and that the
Well,
state of
we agree on
Palestine
that.
should be an independent state that controls its own borders, and the state of Israel should be an independent state that controls its own borders.
If
But right now, the state of Israel controls
if the
both
state
sides
of
of the border.
Palestine is controlled by Hamas, that's fine?
Well, the state of Palestine is going to be a democratic state that will get to choose its own.
And how are you
people.
assuring that it's a democratic state?
That's what they want.
That is what they want, and that's what Hamas wants, which now rules Gaza? And the people, I think most people would like it, but they have the power to make that happen over Hamas, over Islamic Jihad, over the Iranian-backed and others, and Saudi-backed groups that operate in those territories?
Well, the Palestinian Authority did hold elections at the request of the Bush administration over the objections of the State of Israel, and it did, in fact, result in the Hamas party being voted in an election. That's what democracy looks like.
That's not what democracy looks like. That's what the end of democracy looks like.
The end of democracy is when people that you don't like win an election.
Is that what Hamas is, just a group I happen not to like?
No, Hamas is a terrorist organization that has fought for the destruction of the State of Israel. That is true as well, but they ran in an election and won an election, and that is what democracy looks like. So the way that the United States and Israel should be pursuing the empowerment of the moderate forces is by helping them to achieve a two-state solution by actually having something to show. What was wrong with the unilateral withdrawal was the lack of any results that Mahmoud Abbas or Abu Mazen was able to actually show for achieving any sort of independence from Israel. Because it was a unilateral withdrawal, there was no benefit accrued to the moderates. The way that Fatah and Abu Mazen are going to defeat Hamas and the more extremist elements of Palestinian society is if they can actually deliver on a course of diplomacy and negotiation. They had been building a state on the West Bank for the last several years under the leadership of Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad. Economic growth is up, there's security, there is policing, there is all of the basic institutions of statehood that are being built. And when that process is done, which it practically is, they deserve to have the independence that they have worked to achieve. If they can't deliver that, the Palestinian people will reject those who have been forcing negotiations and moderation over the last 20 years and trying to achieve a result.
Look, I totally agree with your account of helping Fayyad. I think the Bush administration and the Obama administration, in a very pretty consistent way, have tried very hard to do that. I think, in fact, the biggest setbacks have been when they've gone from intelligent, step-by-step attempt to help people who want to make a decent society and a successful and peaceful society, a non-terror society on the West Bank. There has been great step-by-step progress. The biggest setbacks have come perhaps when expectations were raised that there could somehow magically be a solution in the next few months or even in the next few years. But anyway, I agree that that's a complicated problem for U.S. policy makers to deal with, and I think governments of both parties here in the U.S. have tried to help the Palestinians get to a point where they can be entrusted responsibly with a state that will not be a terrorist-dominated state, that will not be a state that will cause war on the West Bank.
And they've reached that point?
I hope they've reached that point. They certainly haven't reached that point in Gaza.
But in the West Bank, I think we're well beyond that point.
I don't
Every
think we're
international body has made the judgment that they are fully ready for statehood. The issue is that every day, every week, every month, more and more settlers are moving across the Green Line and eating up more and more of the land that is eventually supposed to be part of that state. And today there are well over 550,000 people who live over the Green Line, and Palestinians are doubting whether or not there is still a chance to have a viable state of their own in the land across the Green Line. And if that isn't stopped, then it's all well and good to say we want them to have a state, we want to have a two-state solution, but if at the same time that you're negotiating over the size and the slices of pizza that you're trying to negotiate over, but you're eating the whole pizza, there's nothing left to negotiate over.
I mean, again, I think the idea that Israel is flooding the West Bank with settlers, especially in the last 10 years, that they're eating the whole pizza, that they are alone responsible for immoderation and terrorism and extremism and lack of commitment,
That's not what I'm
unfortunately,
saying.
to democracy. That is pretty much what you said, to the on the West Bank. 550,000, that includes everyone who's over any part of the 67 line in Jerusalem.
550,000.
So they are settlers.
I said 550,000 people are
You
living.
said the settlers.
Are living across the Green Line. They are living on territory that was not
And you
part
think
of
they
the state
should,
of Israel.
and you think they shouldn't be allowed to live there?
No, I think that there should be a negotiation about what the
Wait,
border.
what's
Israel,
your position on that? Do you
that
think
when
they
there
should
is a
be
border,
allowed to live there?
not illegally,
Well,
but
what
when
about
there is
legally?
a border, right?
As
when there's
they
a
are
border.
now.
No, but there is no legal basis.
So you would uproot the 550,000 people, all the
No.
people in Jerusalem. Well, wait, what are you complaining about then?
What I am saying is that without a border, the entirety.
Yes, I would like to have a border too, but what kind of answer is that? I mean, what do you practically want to do?
Well, the answer is you either come up with a border or you give everybody equal rights. Those are the two choices. You can't have two classes of citizens.
I
You can't
totally
have,
disagree. The current situation is better than a unilateral withdrawal from the entire pre-1967 to the pre-67 borders, or giving everyone equal rights, including the people in Gaza. I would just say that you can say that those are the only two choices. They're not the only two choices. The third choice is basically the status quo, which is not an intolerable status quo. Where, as you just said,
well, it may not be to
people
you.
on the West Bank, their economic conditions are improving.
Recently,
they
Bill?
have.
Have you been there recently?
About a year ago.
Do you really?
I mean, I'm not
feel
pretending here.
that-
I'm here as an American. I'm not here as a participant in Israeli. I'm not Israeli. I'm not sure what I would come down on a lot of these complicated choices they have to make. I don't like sitting here in America and cavalierly talking about 550,000 settlers who are just, I don't know what, flooding into the West Bank with and that as if the entire Israeli government hasn't thought seriously about this, as if Israelis more than us wouldn't wish to have a successful separation from the Palestinians who wish for separation. Obviously, there are a lot of Arabs within Israel itself, and presumably people wouldn't be prohibited from moving and buying land in those areas, et cetera. So I'm not willing to sit here and second guess the actions of every Israeli government, but I would say from an American point of view, we are supporting the Israeli government in what is a good faith effort to try to balance very difficult things to balance, which is to move towards a two-state solution while preventing a Hamas-type, terrorist-dominated, war-causing state on the West Bank or in Gaza, for that matter.
So let's just pick up on that for a moment. So does that mean that you agree with the current way that the Obama administration is handling the situation? And if you don't, what should they be doing?
Yeah, I've been mostly supportive of the Obama administration in the last couple of years after they gave up their foolish attempts to cause huge efforts to cause a huge diplomatic crisis because one apartment building is going up in a part of North Jerusalem that was in any case, going to be part of Israel under any conceivable set of borders that would have been agreed to. I think the Obama administration has moved to the center and really is now behaving not very differently from the Clinton and Bush administrations in much of its Israel policy. They also have toughened up a lot after a terrible failure to support the Green Revolution in 2009. It toughened up on Iran, and the president has said, which I agree with, that you cannot contain or deter a nuclear Iran that is the greatest threat to Israel. He, I believe, has said that, so I guess he would come down on my side of the question you asked at the beginning. So I'm happy to sit here and agree with President Obama to a considerable degree, at least as the policy has moved in the last 2 or 3 years with respect to Israel and the Middle East.
Can I just ask whether or not the emergency campaign for Israel is therefore going to commit to not run attack ads against President Obama for his policies towards Israel?
That was a devastating riposte. No, last I looked, it's a free country, and we're allowed to criticize President Obama when we don't agree with President Obama, and I'm allowed to praise him, as I just did, when I tend to agree with him. I think on Iran, he has moved a lot from where he was in 2009. Do you think he's exactly where he was then?
I do. He laid out a very clear path. He said you have to try diplomacy, and if diplomacy doesn't work, you have to go to sanctions.
Do you agree with the failure to support the Green Revolution in 2009?
I don't think it was a failure to support. I think that if the United States had weighed in the middle of that it would have in fact backfired, and many of the Iranian democracy forces said the last thing that they needed was a vote of support from the President of the United States. So I think that it was completely correct, and the President has actually made some very, very good calls, case by case and country by country, as to the right way to proceed. So yes.
Okay.
So, Jeremy,
you answer the question.
What do you think the Obama administration should do to bring about what you think is the right policy in Israel and Palestinian?
Well, I think that it is very, very hard to imagine. I just came back last night, actually, or yesterday morning from Israel, and I spent some time on the West Bank, looking at the settlement construction. I spent time in Hebron. I spent time in Ramallah, and I think it is very hard to conceive of these two sides on their own sitting down and working out their differences in a negotiation process in which they have voluntarily agreed to come to the table. I think that the missing ingredient in achieving a two-state solution right now is the presence of a very, very active and engaged third party. I'd like to see the United States play that role because I think the United States has the best interests of the state of Israel at heart. I think that the international community should be more engaged. But I think the most important thing the President should do is put down on the table the parameters of the two-state solution that if you do indeed support it, Bill, I imagine that we would agree that it's going to be based on the 1967 lines with swaps, that it's going to have a capital for both peoples in Jerusalem with the Arab sections of the city as the capital of the state of Palestine and the Jewish sections in the state of Israel, that there won't be a right of return for refugees, that the state of Palestine will be demilitarized. I think I've just summarized the basic parameters in under 60 seconds, and this is what President Clinton laid out. It is what was the vision of President Bush in the Annapolis process. It was where Olmert and Abbas nearly got to. But what we need is a president and an international community that's going to put that question in front of these two leaders. You may not think the Palestinians are serious. Others may not think that the Israeli leadership is serious. It is time for us as an international community to call the bluff of both sides and say, if you're really serious about bringing an end to this conflict, if you really are serious about ending the generations of bloodshed and war, we all know what it takes. We all know what a two-state solution looks like. So put those parameters on the table and ask Mr. Netanyahu and ask Mr. Abbas, are you ready to come to the table based on these parameters? And that's the kind of active diplomatic leadership I would like to see the President of the United States take.
So,
Can I say, I don't think the U.S. should be in the business of, quote, calling the bluff of the Prime Minister of Israel. I don't think the United States should be in the business of assuming that the blame for the failure of peace or the failure of a peace treaty, though there's a de facto reasonably peaceful situation actually right now, that the failure of a peace treaty is equally the responsibility of obstinacy or failure to compromise on the part of Israel and the Palestinians, to say nothing of other Arab neighbors who help push the Palestinians in unfortunate directions. So I don't agree that we should, that we need to come in and make those childish Israelis and those childish Palestinians who apparently could never get to an agreement themselves, that we're going to wonderfully come in with not just us, but the international community, which is so wonderfully fair and even-handed when it comes to its understanding of Israel. I'm not willing to pressure Israel in that way. The U.S. should take the position that we think is best, obviously, for the region, and that will include, obviously, a lot of diplomacy, as there have been in Clinton and Bush and Obama administrations, attempts to work with the Israeli government, but I am not willing to impose some sort of even-handed solution or try to impose an even-handed solution on Israel and the Palestinians.
And I didn't use the word impose, and I also didn't say only call the bluff of the Israelis. For those of my friends on my right who believe that President Abbas is not serious about pursuing a two-state solution, I say call his bluff.
Why do you want to call this bluff?
Because it is an
Then
American...
you'll find out that there isn't just... Will that be a better situation 6 months later? Well, we might feel better that we've called their bluff, but it will be better to have talks that break down and collapse in acrimony than the current situation?
The credibility and the national strategic interest of the United States is at stake. This is
Was the credibility and the national strategic interest of the United States helped or hurt by the collapse of Oslo in 2000 and the subsequent Intifada?
The credibility of the United States has been deeply damaged by its inability to bring about a resolution of this conflict. You have a situation...
Where has it been damaged?
All across the world.
Oh, really?
In terms of the international
The whole world
standing,
is sitting there saying, you Americans, you're supposed to magically impose this.
Absolutely. This is something
I don't know what world you live in, and I don't know what world leaders
I live
you
in
talk to.
the same
Which
world
world
as the
leaders?
Secretary,
Which
the
world
Secretary
leaders?
of State of the United States, Hillary Clinton, has said in numerous speeches that when she was First Lady 13, 14 years ago, and she would travel the world, the issue of Israel and Palestine just didn't come up. Today, when she travels the world as Secretary of State, this is often the first issue that world leaders all across the world raise. Why is the United States not doing more to end this conflict when it has the leverage and the capability to do more than it's doing in order to end this conflict? It is undermining American credibility when it goes to the United Nations and it vetoes a resolution in the Security Council condemning the settlement enterprise that uses the language of United States policy over 8 administrations. It undermines your credibility and your legitimacy as the world's sole superpower, and it is now a fundamental national security interest of the United States to end this conflict.
It's a fundamental national It's a much more fundamental national security interest of the United States to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, I would say, but it would be very good if this conflict were, quote, ended. I don't think it will ever be, or unfortunately in the foreseeable future, be fully ended. It will be, the situation could be improved. It could be more radically improved, perhaps, than I realize, and if that happens, that will be great, but that will only be with the willing participation, obviously, of the people in government of Israel and the people of, and their governments in the territories. And I think for now, actually, the Obama administration is sensible in trying to pursue step-by-step efforts in not allowing the UN to suddenly throw the question of Palestinian statehood on the table and force, in a sense, a confrontation between the parties and encourage, I would say, a less good outcome. Again, I just come back to, and it's just not true, incidentally. I mean, I've been in government. It is probably more true 15 years ago at the height of Oslo when there were great hopes and when people really thought, and maybe not without reason, that the Clinton administration could make this happen. Then international discussions were centered on Israel. The idea that in the world we live in now, with China and Russia and the Arab Spring and Iran, that the Secretary of State goes to any, I would almost say literally almost any serious country in the world, including, incidentally, the Arab countries and other Muslim countries, and the first thing they have to talk about is Israel and the Palestinians, it's just a myth.
I'd like to turn this conversation now towards the election. We've talked a lot so far about the issue of Israel, but there's a real question about how important that issue is to the average Jewish voter. Certainly we see a lot of polls that say, in fact, it ranks pretty low, that people are Americans and they're worried about the economy and they're worried about healthcare and they're worried about Iran. So what is your assessment about how important the administration's policies towards Israel are when it comes to making a decision about who to vote for president in November?
Well, as you say, Americans are Americans. Jewish Americans are Americans. Christian Americans are Americans. They're utterly entitled. I've never told people on what basis they should vote or how they should rank different issues. I would utterly respect it if people choose to rank Israel as one of, as I do actually when I vote, as one of several issues, and Israel is only one of several foreign policy issues. We're fighting a war in Afghanistan, we fought a war in Iraq, we have Iran getting nuclear, on a path to nuclear weapons. They're perfectly reasonable for people, including Jews, not to be single-issue voters on Israel. That is fine. I think many Christian Americans, and you said, well, Jews are Americans or Christians are Americans. Many Christians care an awful lot about Israel. They're entitled to vote on that issue if they wish as well. I don't think it, practically speaking, in this election campaign, I don't think it's going to be that big an issue. I think the issue of whether we're doing as much as we can to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons may or may not be an issue depending on what happens over the next 5 or 6 months. But again, I think President Obama has moved sufficiently on these issues from the Cairo speech of 2009 to the AIPAC speech of 2 months ago that the difference between the parties is simply less than it was. I don't think foreign policy doesn't look like it's going to be the major issue in this presidential race. I hope citizens take seriously our foreign policy responsibilities around the world and vote, and obviously some will vote one way and some will vote the other way, depending on their views of how we should conduct our foreign policy. But so I hope you remember that foreign policy is an extremely important responsibility of the President of the United States. But yes, I think most American Jews will not vote on the basis of Israel in this election. I agree with that.
Jeremy, what do you think?
Right. Well, I mean, the facts in this case are on Bill's side. The surveys that we've done and that other organizations have done have shown that really only 7 to 10% of American Jews do mention Israel as one of the top 2 or 3 issues when they consider who to vote for. But it does raise the question as to why people do then run such vitriolic campaigns based on this issue. What is the purpose if it really doesn't move votes? The types of campaigns that are run by organizations like the Emergency Committee for Israel that really do tend to scare policymakers. They run ads and attack campaigns that box people in as anti-Israel for taking a policy position when it comes to these issues. And I think that the way in which Israel's turned into a political football is not good for the state of Israel. It's not good for Israel. It's not good for the Jewish people. It's not good for our relationship with Israel. And I would love to see it removed, in a sense, from the kinds of vitriolic and over-the-top attacks that have tended to happen in the last couple of election cycles.
There are some theories that the reason, particularly in the Republican primary, that there was so much talk about Israel and Iran was actually not to court the Jewish vote, but to court the Christian evangelical vote. Bill, you're in the inside of that. What do you think?
I think most of the Republican candidates I knew strongly believed that we should strongly support Israel and strongly believe that we cannot permit, as the president has said, this regime in Iran to get nuclear weapons. I don't think there's any great and people were saying what they believed. Ron Paul, who was the one major outlier, also said what he believed, and I think the good news is he didn't do well and got less than 10% of the vote, which is good for the Republican Party. I mean, the big story in the Republican Party over the last 30 years, and I'm personally very happy about this as a Republican, is the eclipsing of, I'd say, the Bush, Scowcroft, Baker, traditional, it's unfair to say hostility to Israel, but lack of closeness and warmth for Israel, I think it's fair to say. And I say this as someone who served in the first Bush White House and has a high regard for the first President Bush, but it was not. It was an Arabist, old-fashioned Republican Party, which was skeptical, which was certainly very concerned with our relations with Arab states that were not friendly to Israel, and skeptical, perhaps, of the case for Israel. That they have really been eclipsed, I think, by let's call it the Reagan, George W. Bush, McCain kind of tradition of a more sympathetic attitude towards Israel and greater support for Israel. And then the other thing that for 20 years now has been a worry for many of us on the Republican and conservative side was the rise of a sort of not the rise of, but the return of a kind of Pat Buchanan and then Ron Paul type of hostility to Israel. And the good news is that doesn't have much support in the Republican Party in Congress. It didn't have much support among the presidential field. It doesn't have much support among the up-and-coming young Republicans, the Marco Rubios and Paul Ryans and Chris Christie's and the people who probably will be the future leaders of the party. So if you're asking me yes, the Republican Party, I think, is pretty uniform, actually, pretty united in being strongly pro-Israel, and that's a good thing.
And is this, if I may, I mean, I'm curious, that the direction that the Republican Party has taken, where the denial of the existence of a Palestinian people and the embrace of a one-state solution and the notion that there's really no set need for a Palestinian state that seemed to mark all of the presidential candidates from Newt Gingrich to Rick Perry to Rick Santorum. I mean, is that a good move as well? I mean, are we excited that that's where the Republican Party is headed, towards a one-state, anti-Palestinian party?
Is that really the views of Governor Romney, do you think? Was that the views of the Bush administration?
Well, certainly the views of all of the other candidates who denied the existence of the Palestinian people, and people like Joe Walsh, who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Times just this past week, saying, in fact, that the two-state solution would be bad for Israel.
I will put up the Republican members of Congress against the Democratic members of Congress any day in terms of their support for Israel. There are a few outliers on the Republican Party, but I am proud at this moment, prouder than I was 20 or 30 years ago, to be in a party that is strongly supportive of Israel. Not all of them are expert on the details of the, as nor should they be, and nor are the Democrats, obviously, of U.S.-Israel policy. They can occasionally, Newt Gingrich tried to make a sort of clever historical point and echo Golda Meir in saying there never was a Palestinian people. It was a silly thing to say. It was not embraced.
And you're willing to say that
it was not
wrong?
embraced.
Are you going to say it was wrong?
Yes, I mean, it's a complicated historical question of whether there was a Palestinian people prior to 1948. I mean, that's a legitimate issue, but it doesn't matter now. The Palestinians now have national self-consciousness, and I would be very, very happy if there were a Palestinian state, yes. And Mitt Romney did not embrace what Newt Gingrich said, and last I looked, Mitt Romney pretty easily won the nomination, and we are going to have a very mainstream Republican foreign policy, and there'll be bipartisanship. He'll make Joe Lieberman he'll make, I don't know if you were laughing at the idea of the bipartisanship of the Romney administration or gasping in horror that there might be a Romney administration. I think there's likely to be one. I think Joe Lieberman could well be Secretary of State. I think it's quite, you heard it here first.
Avigdor Lieberman is foreign minister in Israel, so...
you heard it here first. I'm just making a prediction, but if that doesn't make you all, if that's not good, if that's not a good thing from your point of view, that's fine too. Anyway, I think we will have a mainstream Republican foreign policy, set of positions articulated by the Romney campaign, and I think it'll be a pro-Israel set of positions.
Jeremy, is that how you see Mitt Romney's foreign policy towards Israel?
Well, I will say there was a big distinction between Mitt Romney. I would agree with you on that there was a distinction between Mitt Romney and the other members of the presidential field. And I was encouraged when Mitt Romney refused to pander on the issue of the embassy being moved to Jerusalem. And when asked if he would move, or I guess they were all asked in one of the debates, and they were sort of competing over who was going to buy the truck and drive it in order to actually move the embassy, Mitt Romney took a much more considered approach and said he really would consult with the government of Israel, he'd consult with diplomats, he'd consult with others in the region. I thought that was a good sign that he was not willing to pander immediately, but the entire rest of the
Democrats have never talked at all as running for office, have never talked about moving the embassy to Jerusalem.
Right, and it is wrong when it's done by Democrats, and it's wrong when it's done by Republicans. And so I would hope that a Romney administration would in fact be the kind of mainstream bipartisan foreign policy that I believe we did see towards the end of this Bush administration, when Condoleezza Rice was trying to actively participate in the diplomatic resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that was actively pursued by George Bush's father. I don't quite agree with your characterization of him and the policies that he pursued, but that has been a bipartisan approach, and it actually is moderate. It's in the center of American foreign policy to recognize that this is in America's interest and to play an active role in resolving it. So that would be my hope.
But didn't he say he thought the Obama administration threw Israel under the bus?
He did, and I think that was the extent. I mean, really, he has not gone into any of the lengths that the other candidates went, and that seemed to be his sort of pro forma line. But I don't hear within what he has said so far necessarily going down the road of not playing an active role in trying to help the conflict to be resolved and not pursuing a fundamental American interest.
So I'd like to ask each of you a specific question related to your work. Jeremy, I'm going to start with you. some of the criticism that you hear about J Street is that actually the Obama administration and some Democrats have moved away from J Street. I read that, for example, there was quite a high-level person from the Obama administration coming to your first conference, not so the most recent one, that the AIPAC speech that the president delivered a couple of months ago was very much more in line with what AIPAC believed, and that you really, J Street hasn't made a dent in AIPAC's popularity in the White House or in Congress. I think half the members of Congress attended that speech when it was delivered at the AIPAC conference. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't try to put what we're doing into the context of a us versus AIPAC in an institutional way. What I think we're trying to do is to create enough political space for a sensible American foreign policy to be pursued. And I think we've got a very, very tough road ahead of us. I think we've made some headway. I think there is greater political space. I think the fact that this conversation, for instance, is taking place in a synagogue with 600 or 700 people here is symptomatic of a far more open discussion about what it means to be pro-Israel today in the United States. I think that is washing into the political system. I think you see far more members of Congress speaking out today for the notion that American leadership to achieve a two-state solution is a pro-Israel position, that simply standing with Israel, right or wrong, and backing every piece of legislation that comes along that is military, that ensures Israel's military superiority, that's fine, but it's not enough in order to really be pro-Israel. And I see progress on that front, but clearly we have a long way to go, and redefining what it means to be pro-Israel is a gargantuan task, and I think we're doing a really good job after only 4 years.
Bill, are they doing a good job?
Yeah, no, I think Jeremy's done an excellent job of building J Street. It seems to be very formidable. It has regional offices and lots of people working for it, and puts on big conferences, and as they have every right to do, they circulate letters, which they get some members of Congress to sign, and then we criticize those members of Congress for signing those letters, for signing on, which is, I believe, legitimate in a public political debate, and that's what political debate is about. It's hard for me to judge, honestly, how much things have changed in 4 years. I think we've had a little bit of a back and forth. President Obama was certainly, I think it's fair to say, seemed to be perhaps closer to where J Street is than other Democrats running for the presidency in 2007, 2008, and I think the Cairo speech was, the kind of speech that, I don't want to speak for Jeremy here, but I think that people who on that side of the spectrum was sort of happy to see an American president give. I do think he's moved back to the center, and I think an awful lot of Democrats in Congress have just looked, I honestly think, at the situation on the ground and just decided, they may personally be not entirely comfortable with Israel's settlement policy. They might wish that Bibi Netanyahu were a slightly different prime minister, or even that someone else were prime minister of Israel. But given the fundamental issues facing the U.S. in that region right now, that the notion that pressuring Israel to be more reasonable with respect to the Palestinians compared to the questions of how to deal with the Arab Spring, how to deal with the threats of radical Islam in parts of the Middle East and around the world, how to deal with nuclear Iran, above all, that just isn't as central, perhaps, as Jeremy would like it to be to their thinking. But I'm not, I think it's impressive, the organization he's built up, and I hope they continue to have I hope the organization continues to flourish and to have no effect on actual U.S. policy.
Okay, a question for you, Bill. We mentioned before, Jeremy mentioned ECI, the Emergency Committee for Israel, something that you have created, and you are one of the board members. It has been accused of really using smear tactics against President Obama and other Jews. Just want to read couple of sentences from a recent New Yorker piece. It said, "And while the truth is generally an early casualty in the political heat of an election year, ECI stands out in its disregard for it. Of the 5 principles quoted in an ECI ad in the New York Times, 4 have objected to how their words were used. And if I recollect, among those 4 were Abe Foxman from ADL, David Harris from AJC, and Alan Dershowitz, who I think most of us would agree is not characterized as a flaming liberal. So is this appropriate? How do you justify these kind of tactics? And is this the way the conversation ought to happen?
Look, I mean, we'd have to go into the detail. This is really not, if I might say, I'm not going to complain about questions, but I mean, you read a hostile article, excerpts from a hostile article in the New Yorker. We correctly and accurately quoted the people you mentioned discussing not
they
out of
didn't
context.
feel that way, actually.
They didn't like being used. They didn't like us amplifying a point they had made because they felt the administration had sort of backed off and others had backed off in the 3 or 4 weeks, I guess, since they said those statements. But those statements were accurately quoted in that ad, and I'm happy to stand behind that ad. Absolutely.
But they don't think they were accurately
That's
quoted.
not true. That's not true. They didn't like being quoted. Not a single one has challenged the accuracy. The quotes are absolutely accurate. They're taken, from the public record.
But many of them said they were taken out of context. I mean, I talked to Dershowitz myself about this.
I don't believe it's true. You can go look up the quotes and see if it was out of context. He just didn't like the fact that he perhaps wanted to get along better with his Democratic friends and didn't like his quotes being used by ECI. Anyway, you know what? I mean, J Street gets criticized a lot. ECI gets criticized a lot. That's fine. That's fine. People will judge whether our general position on, it's a small organization. We've intervened, tried to do a little bit of good. I think we have done some good in actually energizing the pro-Israel community and in not making it seem, and this was a great achievement of Jeremy early days of J Street, and making it seem that all the momentum was on one side, that the entire Jewish community and other parts of the American political community more broadly were all moving in the direction of the J Street point of view. I don't think it seems that way now, because I don't think it is that way now, and I hope ECI has played a little bit of a part in pushing back against J Street.
Jeremy, do you see those equivalencies?
Well, I think there's a couple things I would say. One is I think the nature of the types of ads that ECI ran in 2010, and I'm anticipating that you'll run again in 2012, have unfortunately turned criticism of policy into a question of whether someone is anti-Israel. And I think that that's been a real important line in the Jewish communal conversation, whether legitimate debate over policy somehow crosses into being delegitimization of the state of Israel or being anti-Israel. And I think, frankly, that ECI has pushed the line too far, and that while there may be disagreements, obviously, between where ECI and your point of view and J Street and where I would come out, neither of us is anti-Israel, and no one who we back is anti-Israel. And the implication that people who support aid to the Palestinians or who feel that the blockade on Gaza was a little too tight, which in fact the Israeli government then loosened a bit, in line with what the people that you attacked called for, I think that you've pushed the debate too far. You have the impact of silencing people on a policy question, and I think that that is an area that we should talk about, whether or not it's responsible and whether or not it's good for the state of Israel, and frankly, good for the Jewish people.
In just a few moments, I'm going to begin to take your questions. So if you have questions written on those cards, please just hold them up and wave them, and someone will come and collect them.
Can I just say a word about this?
Yes, of course, please.
I don't, we'd have to have the documents here and really go through the relative merits and truthfulness of J Street and ECI publications and advertisements and the like. I am proud of what ECI has done. People had thought for a while there that they could be on board the J Street agenda and still say that they were in the mainstream of the pro-Israel community. When you have a letter signed by 54 members of Congress, when you have votes in which 20 or 30 members of Congress vote against the huge rest of Congress, they're totally entitled to cast that vote. It might even be a profile in courage to do so. But we're entitled to say, as a matter of fact, this person took a position that is not in the majority, is not the majority position of the Democratic Party, and that a lot of serious people think would be a position that would damage the security of the state of Israel. We are allowed to make that argument, and that's what we've done.
I would argue that the difference is whether or not you argue over the merits of the policy or you begin to name call and you use the type of attack ad theatrics with the ominous music and the dark photographs and all of that to imply that somehow a member of Congress who courageously stands up and says that perhaps denying coriander to the Palestinian people is not a national security interest of the United States, that person is somehow out for the destruction of the state of Israel. I think it just goes too far, and what it does is it does quelch a serious and real debate about what is the best policy of the United States. And I think that one of the reasons that you only get 50, 60, 70, 80 members of Congress who are standing up and signing these types of letters is because another 200 are scared to do it. And the atmosphere of fear that has been created is not good for Israel. It's not good for a serious American policy-making process, and I don't think it's serving us as a Jewish community.
I mean, only here, honestly, could one get away with saying and be applauded for saying cavalierly that, well, all those hundreds of congressmen on the other side, and I suppose Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand.
I'm not saying
well, someone is. You just said that.
Yeah, no,
all those hundreds are just living in fear. They don't honestly believe. They don't honestly believe that perhaps trashing the Israeli government for enforcing the blockade of Gaza was a bit irresponsible, given what was going on the ground at the time, what had gone on the ground in Gaza just before, and that it was better to step back and let this work out as it has worked out a little bit better over time. But that you think that they couldn't honestly have that view, but they're simply just intimidated, certainly not by ECI, we don't have the ability to intimidate anyone, but by who? Who's intimidating them?
Well, I actually
or
do.
Their constituents, is it possible their constituents actually just agree with that point of view?
I mean, I very seriously and absolutely do believe that a significant percentage of American members of the House of Representatives and the Senate are intimidated on this issue. That is and it is not good.
Well, I can't speak. I spend more time, I don't believe that's fair to either Republicans or Democrats. I spend a lot of time with Republican members, and I think that's simply not the case of the Republicans. They believe what they believe. You may think they're short-sighted, you may think that their beliefs are simple-minded, but I'm just here to tell you that really I'm trying to think of all the Republican senators and House members I know. Very few, almost none of them, I'm not going to say. I'd like to know a single one who is saying pro-Israel things because he's intimidated, rather than that he happens to believe, and he also happens to think his constituents believe, that the case for Israel, the moral and political case for the U.S. standing side by side with Israel, is a very strong case.
Those are two radically separate statements. I would say that you've won the war. We have won the war. 99% of the members of the Senate and the House believe deeply in the U.S.-Israel relationship. That has been established on a bipartisan basis, and there may be, you've got a handful of members of your party, like Ron Paul, who don't agree with it. Maybe there's a handful of members on the Democratic side who don't believe it. But that's the far outliers. 99% of the people on both sides of the aisle strongly support the U.S.-Israel relationship. But when it comes to a sensible, nuanced, rational discussion of what is actually in the United States' best interest and Israel's best interest, many members of Congress and the Senate do keep quiet because they are worried about what the ramifications will be of speaking out. And that's simply a fact. And it is a very, very...
And isn't it kind of a bad debating technique to say many members are intimidated and not give an example?
Well, the problem is that they won't speak out publicly. I have had numerous conversations behind closed doors, and I know many people in this congregation here today who I know about your conversations. You have had those conversations as well. And people feel that they cannot stand up and talk about Israel and talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, talk about the need for a two-state solution in a fair and balanced and reasonable manner because they're worried about the attacks that they will receive. And that isn't good for the making of American foreign policy. It's not good for Israel.
Who's going to attack them? I mean, the New York Tom
Well,
Friedman...
the Emergency Committee for Israel would be at the top of my list.
Right, because... Well, I'm thrilled that we're so powerful. We have the New York Times and the major networks and NPR and all on one side. J Street, which is considerably larger, to say the least, than the Emergency Committee for Israel. They're all on one side, and little old Emergency Committee for Israel is just pulp. That's intimidating, I suppose, these Democratic members from saying the truth.
Right, I mean, at last I checked.
Are these guys in highly competitive races, incidentally?
These are folks that.
Could you mention like an actual? I mean, I do think it's a little bit much. I mean, who is so? You're proud? Are you well disposed to these people who are so cowardly that they won't say what they believe?
No, I actually am well disposed to the people who did speak out, who you attack. That's the people who I'm well disposed to,
Okay, you know
because they
what?
showed courage in standing up for what they believed.
How about we switch to a different topic? In a little bit, I'm going to ask you each to ask a question to each other, but I do want to include the audience questions. There are several here asking for your opinions about the new unity government in Israel. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a little too early to make a judgment over exactly what that government's going to stand for, right? Now, all we know is that in a midnight deal that served the political interests of both Shaul Mofaz, the leader of the opposition, and Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, they reached an agreement to build a unity government. They've made commitments to do certain important things, reforming Israel's governance system, dealing with the issue of draft conscription for the ultra-Orthodox, passing a budget, and dealing with the peace process. That's what they've committed to do. So the question is going to be, after 6 to 9 months, will they have actually achieved significant results, in which case it'll be one of the more significant governments that's ever governed, or at the end of 6 to 9 months, will it look back and say this was just another midnight political deal that helped to save 1 or 2 people's political career for another 6 or 9 months? It's way too early to judge.
What do you think, Bill?
I have that's a sensible answer. It's too early to judge. I'm no expert on I long ago tried to gave up even trying to understand what's going on in Israeli domestic politics. And so I don't differ with Jeremy at all. I mean, I do think it is, if one thinks Israel faces great threats, which I think it clearly does, from a nuclear Iran, or possibly nuclear Iran, I think on the whole, one would be happier to have a more broad-based government with distinguished leaders of different parties in the cabinet. Having said that, I don't think it means necessarily that any particular thing is going to happen in the next 6 to 9 months. And I think Jeremy's right, incidentally, that again, I'm not Israeli, and I'm not in a position to really make a detailed, granular judgment on exactly what their policy should be in all these different areas. But the basic manifesto strikes me as being pretty sensible, and I hope they can succeed in implementing a fair amount of it.
So we haven't talked tonight at all about settlements, or very little. And a question came from the audience. Would you support a moratorium on West Bank settlement? Why or why not?
I think we know my answer.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, I'm not in the position normally of taking positions on internal Israeli matters. I think my sense is that recent Israeli governments have had made sensible efforts to stop provocative settlements in areas that would be beyond the likely boundaries if and when there is a two-state solution. I am not in favor necessarily, but again, it's not my call, honestly, and this is a Netanyahu had a 10-month settlement freeze. Then that didn't do any good, so then he decided to allow natural growth in the settlements and people to move into the quote settlements, which I suppose includes huge neighborhoods of Jerusalem that aren't settlements really in any real sense. So I think it's up to the Israeli government.
And I think that the single greatest threat to Israel's long-term future of being both Jewish and democratic will be the extension of the settlement enterprise to the point that you can't separate the Palestinian and Israeli territories any longer. And that's the real threat that the settlements pose. It isn't about a particular neighborhood of East Jerusalem. It is about for instance, in East Jerusalem, the government supporting an American billionaire buying a house in the middle of an Arab neighborhood and then moving in 10 families and putting in 100 security guards in the middle of that Arab neighborhood so that it becomes impossible to draw a line dividing East and West Jerusalem anymore. That's the death of the two-state solution. And so it's not the neighborhoods of Ramat Eshkol and Gilo and the other areas that would stay with the state of Israel. It's the development in East Jerusalem in areas that are clearly going to be the Arab capital of Palestine, and areas on the West Bank like some of the settlements that are being built on Palestinian-owned land that the Supreme Court of Israel is saying have to stop, and the government of Israel isn't stopping them, and that is the end of the rule of law in a democratic state. So those are the threats. It's not about apartment buildings in Gilo, which I don't oppose, but I think it is about the rule of law, and it's about the ability to still draw a border so you can reach a two-state solution.
And you assume that no Jews could live in anything across the Green Line then, after there's a two-state solution?
No, I think that the problem...
I'm for the rule of law. I don't feel I can sit here and say that there's no more rule of law in the state of Israel. My sense is that of the 190 nations in the world, Israel will be extremely high in the ratings of those who would take seriously the rule of law, abide by the rule of law, have a Supreme Court that has done a lot of that has overruled U.S. government, Israeli government actions and made them do things they didn't want to do. But I respect the rule of law in Israel.
But what happens?
I'm not capable to just say in any particular instance exactly whether a decision is right or not. But
what happens when the Supreme Court of Israel says that an action by the government of Israel is illegal, and then the government doesn't stop doing it?
Well, if it were as simple as that, I suppose we would all simply say and nod and agree and say it would be very bad for government should obey courts. I think we agree on that. I think the Israeli people agree on that. I think Israeli political leaders agree on that. Of course, sometimes it is not quite as simple as you've just said it, but I believe the rule of law is quite strong in Israel, an awful lot stronger than in any other nation in that region, an awful lot stronger than in an awful lot of nations and comparable to the rule of law anywhere, really.
So one of the things I vowed to myself as I stood on the West Bank last week and I thought about tonight is that I wanted to invite you to come with me. Because in all seriousness, it actually is that simple.
It isn't that simple.
No, it is that simple. The Supreme Court of Israel has said that the settlement of Migron and the neighborhood in Ilpana are illegally built.
And this is what we as American Jews have to do. There's a controversy in Israel, and the Supreme Court has come down one way, and they're having difficulty, perhaps, I don't know much about it, enforcing a decision on a very tiny little thing. And this is the top priority for American Jews, to go over there personally and to berate the state of Israel.
I'm not berating. I'm simply saying this is a challenging moment. The fundamental nature of American democracy and the separation of powers was defined when the executive branch agreed to carry out the rulings of the United States Supreme Court. That is a fundamental tenet of democracy. And for 64 years, the state of Israel has abided by that as well. And we are at a critical moment. The very foundations of the state of Israel that I care so deeply about and that you care so deeply about and that we cite as one of the reasons for our close relationship is its democratic nature. That is at risk, and we should care. As friends of Israel, we should care that the fundamentals of democracy are at risk. So come with me.
I'm not going to. I can go.
No, let's go together.
I prefer to go with other friends, frankly. And I do not like. I will say this. I am slightly offended that people can do whatever they want. They can applaud for whatever they want. I personally would not sit here in the comfort of the Upper West Side of the United States of New York, or the Upper West Side of America, hear someone say the fundamentals of democracy in Israel are at risk, and say, which is exactly what you said, and yes, we can really feel good. We are wonderful. Everything here is just so wonderful, and we would never, given the difficult conditions they're in, we would never make some of the tough. Anyway, I don't agree. I don't agree. It's fine. It's fine. I don't agree that the fundamentals of democracy in Israel are at risk. That is a deep disagreement between us. Jeremy believes that. That is why his organization spends an awful lot of time working on and publicizing the kinds of issues he's just talked about. I do not believe the fundamentals of democracy in Israel are at risk. I'm not sure I'm capable of judging all these extremely complicated political and legal issues within the state of Israel. And I believe that as Americans, what we can do is, of course, encourage Israel to do what we think is the right thing domestically, but above all, stand by Israel against existential threats and terror threats from abroad.
But Jane, I mean, this is what has been wrong with pro-Israel advocacy in this country for over a generation now, that the only thing you're allowed to do is to stand by Israel, right or wrong, and that's not a relationship that the American Jewish community is going to tolerate any longer. This is Israel. Israel is a nation of its own citizens, and its own citizens have to vote and make the decisions about what it's going to do. But every Israeli prime minister has said as well that Israel is the state of all the Jewish people. And it does represent us, and we do have a stake in what goes on there, and we are asked to participate, we are asked to lobby, we are asked to give money, we are asked to send our kids, and we have the right to speak out and to say the way in which that country behaves is deeply reflective of the character of the Jewish people and the principles and the values on which we were raised. And if the rule of law and if democratic principles are going to be put at risk, which they are, Bill, and you should go and look into these details, because you can't say, I'm not interested in the details, I'm just going to stand by Israel. That's not going to fly with the new generation in particular of young American Jews.
Please.
I have greater confidence in the new generation of American Jews than you do. I think they will be happy to stand by Israel as their forebears have. I'm not embarrassed by 60 years of American Jewish advocacy on behalf of Israel on the part of the American Jewish community and of non-Jewish Americans, incidentally. I don't think that's something to be ashamed of. I don't think we've had 20 years in which somehow the whole Jewish advocacy effort has gone off the rails. So I fully expect the younger generations of American Jews will stand by Israel as older generations have, and I fully expect the younger generations of Israelis will argue among themselves and work out democratic solutions to the very difficult challenges they face. But the way to work out those, they are very difficult challenges, and there are real trade-offs between security and, well, there are many, many trade-offs, and it's a very difficult and complicated situation. So that's what I think.
Bill, what question do you have for Jeremy?
I don't really have any question for Jeremy. I think he's been very articulate in explaining his point of view, and I didn't come here to play gotcha or to throw some J Street letter or something he said once that he probably regrets he said at him. So I'll pass.
Jeremy, do you have a question for Bill?
Should I be as gallant as he just was? Nah, no. You know, what I want to go back to is something at the very beginning of the debate or discussion, which is that you said the status quo is just fine. And you basically said there is this third choice. And I just want to understand what Israel looks like in the coming 5 or 10 years in your eyes, and how we continue to defend it the way that you are doing as sort of unblemished and the only democracy and better than 190 other countries. If we're going down a road in which more than half of the people that live in this geographic area do not have rights that are equal to the rights of the Jewish people in that geographic area, and so there isn't a full democracy, how do we justify that to ourselves and to our people after all the years of oppression, after all of the countries in which we didn't have rights, in which we were an oppressed minority? How do we justify that?
I think we justify it the way we've justified the last 45 years. I mean, I don't think the last 45 years of Israeli history have been a humiliation to Israel or an embarrassment to the Jewish people. I would love it if they could get out of, if they could separate much further from parts of the West Bank. I wish the separation from Gaza, that it will work better, and I think it, in any case, at least it is separated. So I'm hopeful, and I'm all for engaging with the Israelis and with Abu Mazen and Fayyad in peace processes where possible. I don't believe we can snap our fingers, though, and make it happen immediately. And unfortunately, I think in the current circumstance, if anything, I think going slow, an incremental process, as the Bush administration, the Clinton, well, not so much Clinton, but post-Oslo, the Bush administration and the Obama administration have tried to embark on, is a reasonable way to go.
But over 5 to 10 years, Fayyad and Abu Mazen aren't going to be there anymore. And they're going to be replaced. And what's going to follow them is a one-person, one-vote movement that's going to gain momentum all across the globe. And you may call it delegitimization of the state of Israel, but it's going to be a movement that will be probably the movement around the world for democratic rights, for the rights of an oppressed people. And how can we stand by and let that happen to a country that we care so deeply about?
I don't believe that's going to be the main movement around the world. I believe we've had major movements in Arab countries in the last 3 or 4 years, which I'm hopeful about, which have had almost nothing to do with the state of Israel or Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. And as I say, I hope there is a two-state solution, but simply saying it would be nice that there is a two-state solution does not mean that we right now have the conditions on the ground for a responsible and safe and peaceful two-state solution.
Here's a question from the audience. Should the Palestinians recognize Israel's right to exist? And when?
1988 they did. So I think that one you can. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in 1988. The PA accepted it in 1994. So that's one of the mistaken assumptions in the American Jewish community, is that somehow the Palestinians haven't accepted Israel's right to exist. They did 25 years ago.
Do you agree with that, Bill?
Let's put it this way. I think on the ground in the actual schools that are being run by the PA, the textbooks that are being used, et cetera, to say nothing of Hamas, there is not an unequivocal acceptance of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. There's not an unequivocal acceptance of the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East, and that remains the fundamental reason why there has not been peace, full peace, for 64 years of the existence of the State of Israel.
So the Arab Peace Initiative that is sitting on the table offering full acceptance of the State of Israel into the entirety of the region by 23 Arab countries, that's been sitting there for 10 years waiting for an Israeli response. What more is needed from either the Palestinians or the Arabs in order to say, we recognize the right of Israel to exist in return for achieving an end to this conflict and the achievement of a two-state solution?
Is that a question or a
Yeah,
rhetorical
what
question?
more?
So
You
that's
said
it.
unequivocal.
Your recommendation, I suppose, to the Israeli government, insofar as one were recommending things to Israel,
Is take yes for an answer.
and you think you think those 23 Arab states are just fine with the existence of the State of Israel, and that the guarantees, or the lack of security guarantees in that document, there's no problem there at all?
Well, I think that you make peace with your enemies, not your friends, and we're looking at a way to end a conflict that for 64 years has festered and led to 4 or 5 wars, and I think there is a deep interest on the part of the Arab world in putting an end to this conflict. And they have put forward an offer, and it is an offer. It isn't a final peace treaty. What it needs is a counter offer. That's how negotiations work, and the offer is sitting there, and the Arab League is just waiting for Israel to respond. And the Israeli civil society has come up with an Israeli peace initiative, but it's time for the American government to make use of the Arab Peace Initiative and the Israeli government to make use of it as a platform to be fully accepted into the region.
I mean, last I looked, the Prime Minister of Israel was happy to sit down with the head of the Palestinian Authority and have negotiate on the ground about the actual issues that confront them. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe they simply have to accept this diktat from 23 Arab nations whose, I think, good faith in some cases could be called into question, and use that as the basis of negotiations. Why can't the Israelis and Palestinians simply negotiate?
Well, I think that the goal is actually to get regional peace with the entirety of the Arab world, so it's a very good offer. It is not a diktat, it's an offer, and every Arab leader who has endorsed it continues to say it is in effect, and they'd like to sit down and begin to talk about it.
We have a number of questions about Hamas, and I'm wondering if each of you can just respond in this way. What should the American policy towards Hamas be, and how would you like to see that implemented?
I mean, Hamas
I think
is
current policy I don't have any great policy recommendation with respect to Hamas. It would be great if Hamas could be weakened and more responsible elements in the West Bank, but especially, of course, in Gaza now, could come to power.
And American policy right now is appropriate. Hamas has not renounced terror. It hasn't renounced violence. It hasn't accepted Israel's right to exist. So the official American policy is to not deal with Hamas until they do that, and that's the correct approach. The Israeli government has dealt with Hamas indirectly around the Gilad Shalit negotiations. It has dealt with it indirectly in relation to some of the prisoner negotiations just this weekend, with Egypt playing as a mediator. So if Israel chooses to deal with Hamas indirectly, I don't think we should stand in the way, but that's up to Israel to decide.
So there's concern among some of the people in the audience in terms of the questions that they ask, that this kind of very robust dialogue, which is, kind of so Jewish and so American, could really be misinterpreted by people elsewhere in the world. And we've certainly seen a rise of a lot of ugliness in Europe against Jews in terms of Israel, but also just in terms of being Jews. How much responsibility do we have to keep this kind of dialogue open or more circumspect in terms of protecting the welfare of other Jews?
Well, I think the notion that open debate and discussion about Israel somehow fosters anti-Semitism is wrong. I just don't buy that. I actually think that the more that we discuss these issues and the more that we potentially move towards a situation in which the worldwide Jewish community comes together and recognizes the interest in ending this conflict, it's a good thing for the Jews. So I actually view it just the opposite. I think that that anti-Semitism is rife across Europe. It is rife in the Arab world, and it is there to stay, and it's something that we will always have to deal with. But to use that as an excuse not to have an open discussion about how we feel about these issues is, I think, yet another attempt to staunch the debate and to silence dissent. Do you agree, Bill?
No, I'm for vigorous debate. I mean, I'm for vigorous debate on Israel, and I'm against staunching debate, and I'm for, so I'm happy to agree on that.
Wow. Would you please note?
And I don't think debate has, I mean, as I was trying to say earlier, I think it's a bit of a canard to say that over these, in the past there was this horrible stifling of debate and people weren't allowed to speak up, but now suddenly enlightenment has come and people are saying there's been a very vigorous debate, certainly within Israel and among the Friends of Israel, the U.S. and elsewhere, since the beginning and before the beginning of the creation of the State of Israel, and I think this is a continuation of that, and I don't regard it as particularly alarming, honestly, or as something to be suppressed. I suspect this is one of the things we agree on, where maybe others, some of the other Jewish institutions, who I think have created a bit of a mythical history that at one time there was this total consensus about everything, and that it's really unfortunate to expose these debates to outsiders. I think that's, it's just impractical. You can't conceal these things, and one shouldn't try to conceal these things anymore. The American Jewish community is strong. Israel is strong. Israel can sustain a very vigorous domestic debate. The American Jewish community can sustain a very vigorous debate within itself and in the broader American public on issues related to Israel.
So let me just press you there a little bit, though. Who should be outside the tent? Certainly, you've been critical of people in the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, BDS. Should that be sort of beyond the bounds of acceptable debate?
Well, it's not up to me to say what's acceptable debate, and I don't own the tent, unfortunately, so I can't really kick people out of it, I myself would have limits of people I would appear with to debate, and people who I really do think, who I felt were really sought to destroy the State of Israel, or were so, even if they didn't intend to, were so unbelievably cavalier in the kinds of things they'd endorsed, like a boycott and divestment, and sanctions, that I would personally not appear with them and would not want to, if you will, legitimize them. Not that I have the ability to legitimize or delegitimize people, and I'm sure everyone has to make his own decisions about what he considers a sort of respectable, if mistaken, point of view, as opposed to a point of view that he doesn't wish, or he or she doesn't wish to be in any way not only associated with, but even to be, debating. But we don't control that, It's a big country. It's a big Jewish community. There are a lot of different people in it with a lot of different views. We have people on the Republican and conservative side whom I certainly don't approve of, some of whom I don't disapprove so much that I won't appear with them, and that I've urged that they be expelled or not welcomed into the Republican Party. I said a year ago I would be happy if Ron Paul left and ran as a third-party candidate. I was very happy when Pat Buchanan was allowed, really encouraged, I would say, by George W. Bush and others, and I played a tiny part in this maybe, in 98, 99, to go off and run as a third-party candidate in 2000, and sort of just simply left the Republican Party. I'm happier to have a Republican Party without Pat Buchanan than with Pat Buchanan, but everyone's got to make up his own mind about where to draw that line, and of course politics is different from intellectual things, so you might decide in politics that someone has to be repudiated. It doesn't mean that the person, you couldn't have an interesting intellectual argument with him.
So your red line would be with BDS on the other side of it.
Yeah.
Where's your red line, Jeremy?
Well, I mean, in terms of discussions, I think that you absolutely should engage the BDS movement in discussions. I don't see any reason not to appear with them. I disagree with the movement. J Street is opposed to boycotts, divestments, and sanctions as tactics in achieving our goals. But I don't think that there should be a boycott on the boycotters in terms of a discussion And so we have engaged in debates. We've invited people who support those views to speak at our conference, and we take a lot of criticism for that. But I'm a big proponent of the view of Justice Brandeis that the best antidote for speech that you don't like is other speech, and it is not correct to shut out those views. And we're a stronger community the broader that we allow the discussion to be.
I mean, no one, I just would say, I mean, Jeremy should do whatever he wants with this organization, but no one's talking about shutting down views or quiet or silencing views. But of course, when one does invite people to speak at one's own conference, one is saying this is somehow a view that is at least within the pale of legitimate debate. And I take it you think the BDS movement is such a view.
Well, I think that the people that we have invited represent views and are people who are within the legitimate spectrum of debate. I haven't heard people who are calling for the destruction of the state of Israel, who are anti-Semitic, who are virulently anti-Israel, we would never invite. But there are people who believe that the use of certain tactics may advance a two-state solution, may advance a resolution of this conflict, and I don't think that that crosses the red line.
Well, we are just about out of time, but I can't resist, Bill, asking you a question. Since you had such a big role in picking the vice presidential candidate in 2008 for the Republican ticket, who do you favor this year?
Seems like that's somehow a question I'd be better advised not to answer for the sake of the Republican ticket and Governor Romney's victory in November. So I assume he'll make a good vice presidential pick. The good thing about the Republican Party, and I've had many years and I guess decades now of frustration with the Republican Party, is I do think there are an awful lot of, I hope he does take someone younger actually, and I think there are an awful lot of capable younger Republicans ranging from Paul Ryan in the House to Marco Rubio and Kelly Ayotte in the Senate to a lot of governors like Chris Christie and Scott Walker and others. I couldn't resist throwing that in just to have, just to get that a little one last little rise from the audience, you know.
Make sure everybody's still awake.
Exactly. So, I hope Governor Romney picks someone like that as his running mate.
Any predictions, Jeremy?
Joe Biden will be the vice president.
Well, thank you all. You really have been an extremely wonderful audience. I appreciate your passion and your attention, and frankly, your respect for this very robust exchange.
On behalf of BJ, again, thank you.